The day my stepbrother handed me a garbage bag and told me I had 2 hours to clear out, I didn't say a word. I just stood there in the doorway of the room I'd grown up in, staring at the wall where my dad used to hang his fishing licenses, and I thought, this is how it ends. My father had been dead for 11 days. I'm not going to pretend I handled it with dignity. I sat down on the edge of the bed I'd slept in since I was 7 years old, and I cried. Not quiet crying either. The ugly kind. The kind where you can't breathe right and your whole chest aches like something physical is being torn out of it. My stepbrother, I'll call him by what he was to me, which was nothing, stood in the hallway and checked his phone while I fell apart. His name was Decker. He was 41 years old, my stepmother's son from her first marriage, and he had never once in 12 years called my father anything other than Robert's husband. Like my dad was a footnote. Like the 15 years my father had spent building Callaway Systems from a two-man startup into a regional tech firm worth north of $40 million, was just background noise to the real story, which was apparently whatever Decker and my stepmother had decided it was. My dad's name was James Harlan. He was 58 when he died, and the official cause was cardiac arrest. He'd had a stress test 6 weeks before his death. He came back clean. I know what you're thinking. I thought it too. But I wasn't ready to go there yet. What I was ready for was the will reading. Or at least, I thought I was. My father had a lawyer, a man named Whitmore, who'd handled his business filings for the better part of 2 decades. I had met him at the Christmas party the year before, a thin man with a careful handshake who always seemed to be listening for something in another room. The reading was held at Whitmore's office in downtown Milwaukee. 3rd floor, glass conference table, a water pitcher nobody touched. My stepmother sat across from me in a cream-colored blazer. Her name was Nadine. She had married my father 4 years ago, and for 4 years I had genuinely tried, to make it work. I brought food when she was sick. I called on her birthday. I drove 2.5 hours from Madison when she asked for help moving furniture, which turned out to be Decker's furniture, into what had been my childhood home. She didn't look at me once during that entire reading. The will Whitmore read left the house, the investment accounts, and a 51% controlling stake in Callaway Systems to Nadine. A smaller account, just under $14,000, was left to me, along with what the document described as personal effects to be determined at the family's discretion. $14,000. After a lifetime, I remember the sound of my own voice asking if there was an earlier version of the will, because the one Whitmore was reading had been filed only 19 months ago. He told me that was the most recent document on file. He didn't make eye contact when he said it. I drove back to my apartment in Madison, with the windows down, even though it was 40 degrees outside. I needed the cold. I needed to feel something that wasn't that room. I had $600 in my checking account. My lease was month to month. I'd been working for a small environmental consulting firm for 2 years, making decent money, but nothing that would survive a real emergency. And now I was looking at an emergency. That night I sat at my kitchen table, and I opened the box of my father's things they'd let me take. There wasn't much: his old flannel jacket, a coffee mug from a lake house trip in 2009, a pocket knife he'd carried since before I was born, and at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag like it was nothing, like whoever packed this box just threw it in without thinking, was a small padded envelope with my name on it, my name in my father's handwriting. I sat there for a long time before I opened it. Inside was a key, an old one, the kind with a long barrel and a squared-off bow, not a modern deadbolt key. With it was a folded index card. My dad's handwriting again, and I had to stop and breathe before I could read it, because seeing his handwriting was like hearing his voice and losing it again at the same time. The card said, "There's a property in Harlan County, Kentucky. Look for the red barn on Route 49, half a mile past the Moody Creek Bridge. 3rd post from the left side of the door. You know what to do with the truth when you find it. I love you, son." Daddy read it 4 times. Then I looked at the key in my palm. My father grew up in eastern Kentucky. He never talked much about it. Not because it was painful, but because he said the past was just the past, and he'd rather talk about what was next. His family name, Harlan, was also a county name there, something he mentioned once as a kid and never again. I didn't even know if he still owned property down there. I had no idea this existed. Why would a tech company founder from Milwaukee own a piece of land in rural Kentucky? I didn't sleep that night. I called in sick the next morning, loaded a duffel bag into my truck, and started driving south. It took me 9 hours with a stop outside of Louisville for gas and a sandwich I barely tasted. I'd pulled up property records on my phone before I left. It took some digging, but I found it. A parcel of roughly 4 acres in Harlan County, registered to a James T. Harlan, last assessed in 2019. The address matched the area my dad had described. The drive into the county was something else. The mountains came up out of nowhere once you crossed into the eastern part of the state, not the tall kind you think of from postcards, but old mountains worn down by time, covered in hardwood and pine, the kind of place that feels like it's been quietly waiting for something for 100 years. I found the Moody Creek Bridge around 4 in the afternoon. The road was narrow and wet from an earlier rain. Half a mile past the bridge, there it was, a red barn, faded almost to rust orange, set back from the road behind a gravel pull-off. The land around it was overgrown but not wild. Someone had kept the brush from swallowing it entirely, though it hadn't been tended recently. I got out of the truck and stood there in the gray November air, listening. Nothing. Just wind through bare trees and the faint sound of water somewhere downhill. I counted the fence posts to the left of the barn door, third one in. I crouched down and ran my hand along the backside of the post and found what I was looking for. A rusted metal bracket fixed to the wood, with a small hook. Hanging from the hook was a chain, and on the chain was a padlock, and the key from the envelope fitted exactly. The padlock clicked open. Behind the post, someone had dug a shallow compartment into the ground and sealed it with a flat piece of treated wood. I pried it up and found a metal box about the size of a shoebox. Military green. Army surplus, maybe. It was locked with a second padlock, and the same key opened that too. My hands were shaking by then, not from the cold. Inside the box was a legal envelope sealed with packing tape. A second envelope, smaller, sealed the same way, and beneath both of them a photograph, my father, maybe 30 years old, standing in front of this same barn. He was smiling. There was a woman next to him I didn't recognize, and they both looked happy in the way people look in old photos, like they didn't know yet what was coming. I sat down in the dirt with my back against the fence post and opened the large envelope first. What I found inside took me a long time to process. It was a complete copy of my father's original will, not the one Whitmore had read. An earlier one, dated 7 years ago, notarized, with 2 witness signatures. In it, my father left me 49% of Callaway Systems. He left the remaining 51% to a man named Ridgway, his original business partner and co-founder, who had retired a decade ago and, according to what I knew, moved to New Mexico. There was no mention of Nadine, no mention of the house. The house was to be sold, and the proceeds split between a list of charitable organizations my father had supported for years. There was also a second document in the envelope. It was a letter on Callaway Systems letterhead, dated 3 years ago, from my father to Whitmore, except it wasn't a letter asking Whitmore to change the will. It was a letter asking Whitmore to safeguard a copy of the original will in the event of his death, and to contact a federal attorney named Pierce directly if the original couldn't be located through normal channels. My father had suspected something. He hadn't told me. I didn't know whether to feel grateful or gutted by that, and for a while I felt both at the same time. I opened the second envelope carefully. This one contained a printed email chain, 17 pages, dated across an 8-month window about 2 years before my father died. The emails were between Whitmore and Nadine. I won't describe every page, but the core of it was this. My stepmother and my father's own lawyer had agreed, in writing, in email, with subject lines that said things like revised document timeline and contingency protocol, to replace my father's will with a new one in the event of his death, before the original could be filed through the probate court. Whitmore had been bribed. There was a number in one of the emails. It was not a small number. There was one more document at the bottom of the box. A single page, handwritten in my father's handwriting, not addressed to anyone. It read like a note to himself, or maybe to me. I wasn't sure. If you're reading this, then I wasn't able to protect you the way I planned. I'm sorry for that. I found out about what Whitmore and Nadine discussed, and I didn't handle it the right way. I kept quiet when I should have moved. I was afraid of what it would mean for the business, for the people who work there, for everything we built. I should have been afraid of something else. The barn has held this secret long enough. Time to let it out. Whatever you do with it, do it right. Dad, I stayed in that field until the light started to go. Then I put everything back in the metal box, locked it, put the box in my truck, and drove to the nearest town with a motel. I didn't sleep that night either. The motel was a small place on the edge of a town called Bledsoe. 12 rooms, vending machines in the parking lot, a desk clerk who didn't ask questions, which I appreciated. I laid everything out on the bed and photographed every page with my phone. Then I photographed them again. I emailed the photos to myself, uploaded them to my cloud storage, and texted a single message to my college roommate, the only person I trusted completely, telling him where I was and that if he didn't hear from me in 48 hours, he should call the number on a business card I'd photographed and sent him along with the message. The number was for the federal attorney my father had named in his letter, a man named Pierce out of the Lexington field office. I know that sounds dramatic, but I had just found evidence that a lawyer had colluded with my stepmother to defraud a dead man's estate, and at that point I wasn't sure who knew what. Decker had been calling me 3 times a day since the will reading. I'd let every one of them go to voicemail. Now I started to wonder if those calls were curiosity or something else. I drove to Lexington the next morning. Pierce's office was on the 4th floor of a federal building downtown. I hadn't called ahead. I just showed up with the metal box under my arm and asked to speak with him. His assistant looked at me like I'd wandered in off the street, which I had, essentially. I told her I had documentation of probate fraud connected to a business worth over $40 million and that it involved an attorney licensed in the state of Wisconsin. She went to get Pierce. He was younger than I expected. Maybe 40, with the kind of careful, unhurried manner that made you feel like he'd heard a lot of stories and learned not to react to any of them too quickly. He listened to me for an hour without interrupting more than twice. He looked at every document. He asked me to walk him through how I found the box. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father protected this very deliberately." "Yes, sir," I said. "You understand this is going to take time to unwind properly. We're going to need to coordinate with Wisconsin, and the probate court there has already closed the initial filing." "How long?" He looked at his desk. "Months. Could be more." I nodded. I had the $14,000, my truck, and a duffel bag. Months was what I had. "There's one more thing," I said, and I put the photograph on his desk. My father, young, standing in front of the barn. I don't know who the woman in this photo is, but I think she might have been a witness to something. Or at least, my dad kept her photo with all of this for a reason. Pierce looked at the photo for a long moment. "We'll look into it," he said. He wasn't being dismissive. He meant it. I drove back to the motel. I called my employer and asked for unpaid leave, explaining there was a family legal matter. They gave me 3 weeks and told me to check in. 3 weeks wasn't going to be enough, but it was something. Decker called again that night. This time I answered. He started talking before I could say anything. Something about wanting to clear the air, about the will, about how he understood it might feel unfair, about how there was room to negotiate on the 14,000. The way he said it made my stomach turn. He wasn't offering me more. He was checking to see if I knew anything. I kept my voice flat and said I was still processing everything. I said I'd be in touch. I hung up and sat in the dark for a while. The next 3 months were the hardest of my life, and I want to be honest about that, because I've heard stories like mine that skip the hard part. They jump from "I found the box" to "justice was served," like it was a straight road. It wasn't. I moved out of my apartment in Madison and into a short-term rental in Lexington to stay close to Pierce's office. I went through my savings to cover it. I took remote contract work wherever I could find it. Some environmental audits I could do from a laptop, a few data projects for a nonprofit. I called Pierce's office every 2 weeks and left messages when he wasn't available. My stepmother filed a motion to expedite the sale of Callaway Systems in January. She wanted to liquidate and walk away with the cash before anything could be contested. Pierce's office caught it and filed an injunction the same week. The judge granted a temporary hold on the sale. That was the first moment I believed it might actually work out. In February, Whitmore was contacted by federal investigators. I wasn't in the room for that, but Pierce told me afterward that Whitmore had agreed to cooperate within the first meeting. He had email records that confirmed everything in my father's box, and then some, including a third party I hadn't known about, a financial advisor at a firm in Chicago who had helped structure the asset transfers in a way that would have been very difficult to trace. All three of them, Whitmore, Nadine, and the financial advisor, were eventually charged. Decker was not. As far as investigators could determine, he hadn't known about the fraud itself. He had known his mother wanted control of the estate, and he'd been happy to help her exercise it. But there was no evidence he'd been part of the scheme. I'm not going to pretend I know how to feel about that. Some days I think about the way he stood in that hallway checking his phone while I cried, and I feel one thing. Other days I think about the fact that he lost his mother to a federal prosecution, and I feel something else. Life doesn't always wrap up clean. The probate court in Wisconsin reopened the estate in March. The original will was validated after 6 weeks of proceedings and 2 hearings I attended in person, sitting in the gallery while lawyers talked in careful language about things that had broken my life. The day the judge ruled, I was sitting in a hallway outside the courtroom. I didn't go inside for the ruling. I couldn't. I found out from Pierce's associate, a young woman who came out into the hallway with a very controlled expression and then allowed herself a small smile before she said, "The original will has been recognized as valid." I sat with that for a while. My father's original business partner, the man named Ridgway, was contacted in New Mexico. He was 73 years old and in reasonable health, and when Pierce's office explained what had happened, he called me directly. He had a voice like old wood, unhurried and solid. He said, "Your father talked about you all the time. I always knew you'd figure it out." I didn't know what to say to that. I thanked him and told him I was looking forward to working through the next steps together. He laughed, a short, genuine laugh, and said, "Let the lawyers handle the next steps. You've done your part." We sold the company. It wasn't a difficult decision. Ridgway and I talked it over and agreed that neither of us was positioned to run a tech firm and that the right thing was to find a buyer who would keep the staff intact. The team at Callaway Systems, 23 people who had built something real, deserved better than 2 inheritors who didn't know the business. We sold to a mid-size regional firm that agreed in writing to retain all full-time employees for a minimum of 2 years. The sale closed in late summer. The number after lawyers' fees and taxes was not what my stepmother had expected to walk away with. It was what my father had intended for me from the beginning, and I won't share the exact figure here. But I will tell you it was enough to make the past year feel like it had actually happened, and not just to me. There was still the photograph. Pierce's office had found the woman. Her name wasn't relevant to the federal case, but he passed along her contact information anyway, said she'd been willing to speak with me if I wanted. Her name was Helen. She'd grown up in Harlan County, knew my father when they were young. They'd kept a loose correspondence over the years, she said. The kind of occasional letters that don't mean anything dramatic but mean something steady. She told me my father had loved that piece of land, had gone back to it a few times over the years, just to sit and think. She said the last time she'd seen him, about 5 years before he died, he'd told her he was leaving it to his son, and that he hoped his son would know what to do with a quiet place. I drove back down to Harlan County in September. The weather had turned cool but not cold, and the trees along Route 49 were starting to go orange and red in the way eastern Kentucky does it, which is to say, completely and without apology. I walked the 4 acres. I sat inside the barn for a while, on an old wooden crate someone had left in the corner, probably 30 years ago. The light came through the gaps in the siding in long, straight lines. It was the quietest I had felt in a year. I didn't know yet what I was going to do with the land. Build something, maybe. Nothing big. A small house, or a cabin, or maybe just a place to come back to when the world got loud. My father had left me a lot of things in the end. The property, the money, the company. But what I kept coming back to, sitting in that barn in the September light, was the index card. You know what to do with the truth when you find it. He was right. I had known. Not because I'm particularly brave or smart, I'm not, but because he raised me to believe that the truth was worth the cost of protecting it, even when the cost was high, even when you were the one paying it alone. I locked the barn behind me when I left. Kept the key on my keychain where it still is. The drive back north takes most of a day if you don't rush it. I didn't rush it. I stopped at a diner outside of Berea, Kentucky, had coffee and a slice of pecan pie, and sat by the window watching the late afternoon traffic on the highway. Regular people going regular places. Trucks, minivans, a school bus. The world moving at its own pace. Indifferent to the past year of my life, which is exactly what you want sometimes. My father used to say that the most dangerous thing a person could do was confuse what they were owed with what they could take. He said the two felt the same from the inside but led to completely different places. Nadine had confused them, Whitmore had confused them, and it had taken everything from all of them. My father left me the means to rebuild. That's the part I think about now. Not the fraud, not the courtroom, not the months of uncertainty and contract work and motel rooms. Just that image of him, 30 years old, standing in front of a red barn in Harlan County, smiling at whoever was holding the camera. He had known even then that the world didn't always honor what was right. So he built something that did. I put the truck in drive and headed back north. The key is still on my keychain. The land is still mine. And whatever comes next, I'll meet it the way he taught me to.